My name is Khalil Jahshan. I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And I'd like to welcome every one of you to this special briefing dealing with a very important topic, the future of U.S.-Saudi relations, a diplomatic perspective, particularly focusing on the current, if you will, turbulence that the bilateral relationship is going through. And we are very, very honored and pleased to have a briefer or a speaker today, actually, to discuss this, who is very well qualified to do so and has been very vocal on the relationship for many years, Ambassador Robert W. Jordan. And before I introduce the speaker, let me just say a couple of words about the session today. It's going to be slightly different than you're used to, in the sense that we usually have a presentation and then a Q&A. Today we're going to do a conversation. The ambassador was kind enough to request that and to agree to do that. So he and I will be engaged in the art of conversation in few minutes for about 20 to 25 minutes or so. And then we'll open it up for Q&A for the balance of our time. In addition, for those of you who are here for the first time, we have a tradition at Arab Center, which is we do our Q&A in writing. So these cards that are on your seats are meant for that purpose, and there are some pencils, I think, available there if you don't have a pen. So please, if you have a question or a comment, preferably a question, write it down, identify yourself, your affiliation, and brief question, preferably written in a Western alphabet so I can read it. And just raise your hand with your card. Staff will collect the cards at the right time and bring him up here for me to present to our guests. And the center usually tapes this presentation, and after short editing this afternoon, it will be posted on our website if somebody wants to take a second look at it or would recommend it to colleagues who have not had the chance to join us this morning. Feel free to do so. I would like to also announce at this time that next month we have a new publication coming out at the center, which is essentially a publication about the proceedings of our annual conference last year, the title of which was The Arab World Beyond Conflict. It doesn't look very promising at this time to look at the Arab world without conflict, but we dare to think at the Arab Center, and it has some names that are very familiar to you who participated in the conference. So there will be chapters by Shadi Hamid, Nuha Abu Dahab, Mahran Kamrava, Linda Bishai, Sarah Leah Whitson, Basma Momani, Daniel Bromberg, and other colleagues at the center. Some were guests, some who are members of our staff and who write for us. Let me go ahead now and introduce our speaker. Ambassador Jordan is a diplomat in residence and professor of practice in the John Tower Center for Political Studies at Southern Methodist University. He served as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2001 to 2003. He took charge of his mission in the wake of the attacks of September 11 at a critical time in U.S.-Saudi relations. He worked closely with President George W. Bush and senior government officials in maintaining the relationship with Saudi Arabia, combating terrorism, and promoting economic reform and human rights in the kingdom. He spearheaded American encouragement of the Saudi economic reforms necessary to qualify for accession to the World Trade Organization at the time. Ambassador Jordan was a partner in the international law firm Baker Botts for many years and actually headed the firm's Middle East practice based in Dubai until his retirement in 2014. He is vice chair of the Tower Center Board of Directors and the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth. and a member of the Board of Governors of the Middle East Institute and the Southwestern Medical Foundation. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and a past president of the Dallas Bar Association. Ambassador Jordan is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Center for American and International Law and the Board of Directors of the Tate Lecture Series at Southern Methodist University. He also serves on the advisory board of the bilateral U.S.-Arab Chamber of Commerce and is a frequent commentator with international media, including CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, Bloomberg, and the New York Times. His memoir, Desert Diplomat, and some of you have wondered why we were playing that video earlier to plug the ambassador's excellent book. I encourage all of you to watch it. We'll play it again after the program, and to acquire a copy of that book, Desert Diplomat, Inside Saudi Arabia Following 9/11, which was published by Potomac Books in 2015. Ambassador Jordan, welcome to Arab Center, Washington.
Thank you,
and thank you for joining us today. Let me start with a few questions pertaining to kind of the background, if you will, of the bilateral relationship between Washington and Riyadh, and then we'll delve a little bit deeper into some of the issues that pertain to more contemporary issues. Academics, analysts, diplomats routinely refer to the 80+, 86 actually, if I'm not mistaken, year-old U.S.-Saudi relationship as a special strategic alliance based on common interests. As a former U.S. ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, what are these interests, or values, as some prefer to call them, if any, that bind the two countries together?
These interests have shifted a bit over the years. Certainly at the very beginning, when President Roosevelt met King Abdulaziz on the USS Quincy in 1945, our interest predominantly was a secure, reasonably priced supply of oil, and the Saudi interest was protection, security. Over the years, we have actually found successive periods when our interests converged on other matters. For example, fighting communism in the 1970s, especially after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, we partnered with the Saudis to encourage the jihadis led by Osama bin Laden to go after the Russians in Afghanistan. We partnered again after Saddam Hussein invaded the Kuwaiti oil fields and was setting out to go after Saudi Arabia. We have partnered further, particularly since about 2003, in fighting Al-Qaeda, fighting the Islamic State, fighting extremist terrorism in the Middle East. And so we have had a series of converging interests. I wouldn't go so far as to say we have much overlap in values, but it has been a successive period of converging interests. And when those interests have died down, when the crisis that we've jointly addressed has died down, there have been periods also when that relationship has become more troubled.
As a student of the Middle East over the past several decades, I will not count them at this time, but I noticed several scholars and experts refer to U.S. policy in the Middle East in terms of its interest and in terms of the failure of successive U.S. administration to kind of reconcile these different sets of interests, which especially when they change, as you just indicated. I remember particularly, I think, Seth Tillman, who used to work in the Senate and taught at Georgetown University in the mid-'80s when he wrote his book about U.S. interests and Middle East policy. He said something like to the effect, and I'm just paraphrasing, that when you look at the set of U.S. interests in the region, there seems to be nothing wrong with them individually, but the combination is very difficult to reconcile. Did you sense that when you served as our ambassador in the region?
In a sense, yes. We had a strong interest, of course, following 9/11, and I arrived in Saudi Arabia 1 month after 9/11. And so it was really 9/11 all the time, 24/7 for quite a long period of time. And we had a disconnect at the very beginning, trying to get the Saudis to understand the importance of fighting al-Qaeda, fighting terrorism, and the fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. They were in denial for a great period of time, with a few exceptions, notably Prince Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister, who certainly understood the threat and the problem. And so we had disconnects in terms of not only admitting what the problem was and agreeing on it, but also on how to counter it. So we had great difficulty in getting Saudi intelligence to share their information with us. They wouldn't share the pocket litter that they would pick up from people they had arrested or detained. They wouldn't allow us to interrogate them. They wouldn't allow us even to watch through a one-way mirror. So we had a period of almost a year in which this was a very difficult, almost contentious situation. At the same time, we were operating Operation Southern Watch, flying missions over Iraq to maintain security of the population below. And the Saudis would not give us sufficient air clearances to launch our fighters and our support aircraft. So there was a sense that the Saudis were insisting on their sovereignty and were almost hostile to the presence of American forces, trying essentially to make the world safe for them as well.
When you look at the relationship today and you see the hesitance on the part of this administration in coping with the turbulence that we are witnessing in the relationship, it has become visible over the past few weeks and few months that there is some sort of a divergence between our legislative and our executive branch with regards to some of these turbulent aspects of the relationship, be it the Khashoggi affair, be it the war in Yemen, be it the dismal kind of vicious humanitarian disaster that we are witnessing in Yemen, leading to even some measures in Congress that have either materialized or are on the way to materializing, pertaining to even halting, which was unthinkable, even a few months ago, halting U.S. military coordination or support. Would these, in your judgment, having served in Saudi Arabia, would these types of measures help to restore the relationship back on track?
I think it's important for all branches of our government to exercise their constitutional responsibilities, including Congress. Congress, in some ways, is closer to the people than many people in the executive branch. And what we see emanating from Congress right now is really the product of a number of years of buildup. I think there's still a hangover from 9/11. There is still a brooding resentment of Saudi Arabia and the fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, and the fact that they still propagate intolerant information in their textbooks and in many of their madrasas around the world. And you pile onto this the war in Yemen, the Khashoggi murder, the kidnapping of Hariri in Lebanon. And all of this, I think, has now cascaded, and it's been aided by the fact that Jamal Khashoggi was a journalist with the Washington Post. And this has captured the imagination of the media around the world to a much greater degree than many other murders and kidnappings and atrocities committed around the world. And so it has all cascaded, I think, to build within Congress an appetite for reprisal and sanctions. Will it damage the relationship? In the short term, I would say yes, and perhaps it should, because it may require a recalibration of the relationship. As I was saying earlier, these interests that we talk about are shifting. We have much less interest in a supply of oil right now than we did, although it's important to remember that oil is a fungible commodity traded around the world, and that part is important. We still have vital interest with the Saudis, but they have shifted somewhat. And so, bearing that in mind, I think it is appropriate for us to ask ourselves, what do we want from the Saudis today? What are we prepared to offer them? And what are these national interests? If you look at the current administration, it appears to be countering Iran, number one. and probably number 2 and 3. Protecting Israel, I think, is a subset of that. So the Saudis see Iran as an existential threat. The Israelis see the same threat. And the current administration views that, I think, as its primary operating theory in dealing with the relationship, perhaps at the expense of American values.
I would like to get into a little bit more detail about what you just, the points you just raised. But let me ask you another general question before we do that. The period you spent in Riyadh, 2001, 2003, as ambassador, I did frequent Riyadh at least 2-3 times a year during that period, and it was a very important period, as you indicated in your earlier answer. Just having discussed this with so many Saudi thinkers, academics, leaders over the years in dozens of visits to the kingdom, it always puzzled me. Has this relationship really between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia reached the strategic level that both sides claim to have or would like to have?
Well, I think in some ways it has eroded. The strategic level is not what it used to be. I do think the current administration sees a strategic value of a critical nature in countering Iran, as I said a minute ago. But if you look at the other elements of a strategic relationship, just in the abstract, you want to have a vision of where is it going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I think this is where there are some dangers and some pitfalls, because the Saudi economy is changing. There are political and social stresses within Saudi Arabia that are bubbling up. They have a massive youth bulge. They have underemployment, and they have overdependence on oil. And so they have not yet managed to transition out of that. And I think the United States is perhaps not in as good a position as it could be to help achieve that, partly because of all of these difficulties that we discussed a second ago.
Okay, based on what you just said, that the strategic value of the relationship could have had some setbacks in recent times. When I look at our relationship with Riyadh today, we don't even have an ambassador there. I know that John Abizad has been nominated, but the appointment has not been approved yet. Does that have an impact? I mean, what is the relevance of not having an ambassador in a key ally, in a country that is a key ally of the United States?
I've been beating that drum for quite some time, as perhaps you know, and I think it is really absurd that for 2 years we have not had an ambassador in not only Saudi Arabia, but many other of the Gulf countries that are so critical to our relationships there. General Abizad has now been nominated finally. I would encourage all of us to pay careful attention to his confirmation hearing when it comes up soon, hopefully. I think he will be an excellent ambassador. And we needed someone there from the very beginning to get in the Saudis' face about some of these issues that we're concerned about, to help them understand that we will be their partner depending on their conduct and their behavior. But he has to understand what's going on the ground day by day with his staff, and communicate back to the President and the Secretary of State. He needs to interact with his counterparts in Saudi Arabia and help develop what a long-term policy would be. What is the strategic role of our relationship with Saudi Arabia going forward? It simply isn't just Iran. It has to have a much broader context, and this is what people like the ambassador can help formulate.
Let's move to current affairs, more contemporary issues within the alliance. We mentioned the word or the name Khashoggi a little while ago. As most of you know in the audience, on October 2nd, 2018, Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who happened to be a personal friend, who was on this stage with me only a few months before his assassination and brutal assassination in Turkey, in Istanbul at the Saudi consulate. Unfortunately, Jamal probably was not the first nor the last journalist to be assassinated worldwide, and The crime, however, to the dissatisfaction of many Saudis, including some friends that I've had for many, many years, somehow the crime has assumed, as the ambassador alluded to a couple of questions back, assumed a much larger than life significance worldwide. What caused this global reaction again? I know you answered it partially, but I'd like to give you another chance.
I'll take it a little further. Jamal, I think, was viewed, certainly by those who know him, and I met with him a number of times as ambassador, as a gentle soul, an articulate, sincere, compelling figure who was not afraid to express his views, but in no way was threatening any kind of regime change, was threatening any kind of destabilization of the monarchy. He was providing his best advice, as any of us would want advisors to suggest to us what we could do better. And there were certainly many ways he thought the kingdom could do better. I think the brutality of his murder, the graphic nature, the leaks of the particulars, particularly with the Turks playing it up somewhat, I think, and then again coupled with the residual resentment from 9/11, the war in Yemen, and the fact that he was a journalist and the media was particularly interested, all converged to make this a horrific example of the kind of brutality that should not be practiced by an American ally. I think we've got a comparison perhaps to what President Bush 41 faced in Tiananmen Square with the Chinese. This again was a horrific act. Thousands of people were killed during that period. And Secretary Baker and President Bush at that time decided that they would levy significant sanctions on China as a consequence. But they never once pulled their ambassador. They never once decided to terminate relations. They never tried to cut off the lines of communication. And this is certainly, I think, a paradigm or an example that we could consider in this case as well.
Excellent. In terms of the handling of what has become known as, I kind of hate to use that term, but it's the Khashoggi affair, if you will.
I call it the Khashoggi murder.
Murder. That's a much more precise, I think. The way it has been handled across the board, but particularly by the Saudi government, I mean, this rather slow, indecisive, somewhat painful, and slow to come, if you will, admission of what happened. Some of you are familiar with a little article I wrote at the time, only 4 or 5 days after the murder, in which I referred to the Saudi reaction as reminiscent of the Kubler-Ross and Kessler stages of grief model, in the sense of you begin with denial, and then you move to anger, you move to depression, you move to bargaining stage, and then you move somehow at one point to some acceptance of the responsibility. I think we saw some movement in that direction by statements, official statements in Saudi Arabia, but it's been frustrating, frankly, and sad for some of us to watch some sort of a reversal lately, particularly some of the recent remarks in town by the former foreign minister, Adel Jubeir, who's a good friend, and I know he's in a serious kind of predicament continuing that position. But I feel like there is denial 2.0 all of a sudden. The difference between the first denial was a denial of facts. Denial 2.0 is a denial of responsibility. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, I think that's a good characterization, and it reminds me of my arrival in Saudi Arabia after 9/11. And of course, we're all asking, how could it be that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis? And so I went to see the governor of Riyadh, Prince Salman, of course, who is now the king. And I asked him that question, and his answer was, oh no, this was not a Saudi operation, this was the Israelis. The Mossad did this. And then Prince Naif, the Minister of Interior, gave me the same answer. And it wasn't until I saw Prince Saud al-Faisal that I got a straight answer on this issue. And so I think there are similarities here in simply coming up with a story, which they scramble to try to make people believe. They were used to manipulating the media before the days of Twitter and the internet in a way where they could get away with this. But the technology has changed. The believability of the story was laughable if it weren't so tragic. And so I think they have, in many ways, harmed their own case by coming up with these implausible stories. And then again, as you say, denial of responsibility. If you take it a step further, though, what have they actually done to punish or prosecute those responsible? They have arrested a portion of the hit team and have demanded the death penalty, I think, against 5 of them.
Correct.
But the one who perhaps orchestrated most directly the operation, Saud al-Qahtani, was fired from his job but remains free to this day and continues, apparently, according to reports, to advise the Crown Prince. And so, again, they're not only not taking responsibility, but they're not holding accountable those who every conceivable investigative body has found to be responsible.
Let me ask you about Mohammed bin Salman, MBS. Do you know Mohammed
No.
bin Salman?
He would have been 13 or 14 when I was
He was a
ambassador.
teenager when you were there.
And he may have been controlling things behind the scenes in those days. Yeah. But I knew his older brothers.
Yes.
And respected them. I thought they were well-educated, important figures in Saudi Arabia. And I met with all 3 of them quite a bit.
You've been quite vocal in your criticism of some of his ideas or his proposals, if you will. I think you mentioned in a recent interview that MBS owns nearly all of the policy failures. I think on CNN you said that in an interview with Anderson Cooper. He owns really all of the policy failures of the kingdom over the past 2 years. Could you explain?
Well, first of all, he owns all of the policy of the kingdom over the last 2 years, most of which have failed, I think, at least up to this point. His Vision 2030 plan was an ambitious plan and one that I totally subscribed to when it came out. I thought it was a useful document, one that was perhaps too ambitious to be realistic, but it was at least aspirational in a very important direction, weaning the Saudis off of oil, providing a more socially conducive environment, liberating some segments of the society, and finding ways to develop foreign direct investment. The problem was it was premised on an IPO for Aramco, which was from day one an impossibility because it was not going to be possible, I think, to meet the disclosure obligations of the stock exchanges and the regulators for Aramco to go public, at least at the 5% part. If you look at the rest of these policies, the war in Yemen, I don't think anyone would say that's a success. I think it's pretty well concluded that it's the worst humanitarian disaster on the planet today. If you look at the kidnapping of Prime Minister Hariri in Lebanon, if you look at the blockade of Qatar and the apparent effort to turn Qatar into an island by erecting a moat, all of this is so fanciful, so outrageous, and so unrealistic that certainly I think this Crown Prince needs to be held accountable for that.
I understand that he was probably too young to meet at the time you served as ambassador there, but you knew the environment, the political environment. You've dealt with his dad as governor of Riyadh. I'm just curious, what happened to Saudi Arabia from that period to today to allow for these types of ideas and this modus operandi to emerge in a country that we all thought was too conservative to allow for that, too timid, if you will, and too careful in terms of its foreign policy, as you referred to, Saud al-Faisal. What happened to allow for that today in the open like that?
I think you had a geriatric set of leaders for many years, many of whom were dying at about the same time. So Prince Sultan became Crown Prince, he died. Prince Nayef becomes Crown Prince, he dies, and then Prince Salman comes in to be the new Crown Prince in his late 70s. You had a slow-moving train wreck coming through the system of unsustainable government employment, unsustainable drains on the Saudi treasury, and an aged bureaucracy that was providing incompetent and corrupt governance throughout much of the kingdom. For example, the floods in Jeddah that were never corrected and other situations like that. And so it wasn't a terrible surprise that they would reach down to a younger generation for the next crown prince. We saw Prince Mukran for a moment. He's of the older generation, but a younger guy. And then we saw Mohammed bin Nayef. And in my view, he was the perfect crown prince. He and I worked very closely together in counterterrorism activities. He was a solid, pro-Western, smart, diligent leader. But he had the wrong father. And so Mohammed bin Salman was able to elbow him aside with the assistance of his father and essentially staged a palace coup. He then consolidated power, particularly with the Ritz-Carlton episode in late 2017. But it became possible for this coup to occur by the convergence of all of those forces and almost desperation to find a way out of this descent into economic despair, lack of private sector jobs, bulging youth, lack of human capital, lack of education. And so this young crown prince seemed quite appealing to many, including many American journalists who wrote great puff pieces about him when this all came forward.
That's true. You mentioned Ritz-Carlton. I'm tempted to ask a few questions about that, but I would rather just limit it to one or two at this time because we're running out of time. But having interacted as ambassador with the political and business elite of Saudi Arabia during your both tenure as ambassador and your business career in the region, you get to know a lot of these leaders. And to witness some of these names, you know, like Mit'ab bin Abdullah, his brother Turki, his other brothers, Walid bin Talal, Walid al-Ibrahim, Bakr bin Laden, Amr al-Dabbagh, Muhammad al-Amoudi. I'm sure you dealt with all these people because
Yes.
I used to frequent the kingdom
Yes.
during your tenure there. How does it feel like? How did that, in your judgment, impact the reputation, both business-wise and political-wise, of the kingdom?
Well, it was a shocking episode, and I did deal with most of those, not simply during my time as ambassador, but during the years I was in Dubai as well. And actually, I met with Prince Al-Walid bin Talal just a few months before he was incarcerated. It was a shocking episode. This was like arresting Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and holding them and torturing them and turning them upside down for billions of dollars. And so it was demeaning, I think.
107 billion, supposedly.
Supposedly. Now,
Was
how
that
much
worth
of that
it?
was how much of that was cash, and how much of it was interest in companies, and how much of it was simply a lie, we don't know. But that's a difficult way to make up for budget deficits, and it's also not sustainable. You can only do that once. So I think it colored, I think, our view of this emerging leader, this young crown prince who was going to come in on a stallion and really be an agent of change. It showed the brutality he was willing to implement. And ironically, of course, one of the people detained was Ibrahim al-Assaf, who has now become the new foreign minister.
That's right.
So there is rehabilitation possible, I suppose.
Quick.
He got his parole from the Ritz-Carlton, and now he's foreign minister.
Ambassador Jordan, we are just a couple blocks away from the White House, and the Trump administration has been refusing to actually investigate what we talked about in terms of the Khashoggi murder, or to even abide by what people in Congress perceive as U.S. law with regards to the Global Magnitsky Act and so on. How do you react to this policy that seems to put personal or American business interest ahead of political national security, and moral considerations?
Well, I think we cannot view Saudi Arabia simply as an ATM machine. We have to find ways to emphasize American values, to emphasize what I think are universal values, not simply American values, in our dealings with our allies and our adversaries. And so it is shocking to me that after the period of investigation mandated by the Global Magnitsky Act, this administration came down and did nothing. They have sanctioned a number of the so-called henchmen by refusing or by withdrawing their American visas. This simply means they can't come here and go to Disneyland. That is a tepid response to this kind of brutality, and again, the kind of sanctions that we should, as a mature country, be able to impose even on an ally in times such as this. We seem to be at the mercy of the Saudis when the reality should be that they need us more than we need them.
Do you feel that this administration is confusing the nature of this alliance? Is it an alliance between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, or an alliance between the Trumps and MBS?
Well, it seems quite personal right now. And one of the things President Obama was actually criticized for was failure to develop personal relationships, particularly with the Israelis and the Saudis. And I think this administration has taken that to a new level where, at least according to reports, Jared Kushner and MBS chat frequently and tell each other jokes and anecdotes and also discuss policy. I don't know how accurate those reports are, but it does appear that there is some failure to recognize what overarching American policy interests are. And how do we best protect both the Saudis and the Israelis and our other allies? It is not by the kind of conduct that we appear to be sanctioning from this Crown Prince.
There has been a lot of talk about some individuals within the administration, officials within the administrations, about concepts like Arab NATO, referring back to, I guess, what you mentioned with Iran, and Iran as the three top priorities. Also, the term MESA all of a sudden is being used. I did tell our MESA, the Middle East Studies Association, to actually sue the administration for taking, for taking that name. But, you know, we're talking about Middle East Strategic Alliance that people keep dreaming about. Do you think these ideas are realistic at this time?
Not at this time. At one point, it seemed quite plausible that certainly the Gulf Arab states could coalesce into a military and political force that could operate as a bulwark against Iran or other threats externally to them. But the dispute with Qatar, the fact that Oman is very hesitant to join this kind of an operation as well. Even Kuwait, I think, is now having some second thoughts about it. And so you're going to have the Saudis and the Emiratis, basically, perhaps joined by Bahrain to the extent it matters, and potentially Egypt, as some sort of group. But what are they going to do, and how effective can they be without interoperability with United States forces and armaments and apparatus? The availability of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is compromised now by the dispute with Qatar. And so I think we've got practical problems that simply can't be solved. And every 10 years you hear that there's going to be some sort of Arab military or political union. They couldn't even agree on a monetary union because they couldn't decide on in whose capital the headquarters would be. So I think it's going to be difficult for them to reach agreement, and it's going to be difficult for them to represent that much of the Arab world.
Okay, well, I address the last question to the ambassador. We kind of have exhausted his patience. I would like to remind you that we will be taking your written questions. If you already have them, just raise your hand, stay seated, and staff will pick those up from you. And the last question, Mr. Ambassador, is should all of a sudden the back door open and Mr. Trump walk in and say, okay, Jordan, what do you want me to do in the region with regards to Saudi Arabia? What would your key recommendation be to him?
Sure. Certainly first, getting the ambassador on the ground over there is number one. I've been asked that question before, and that's always my answer. Get, hopefully, Ambassador Abizaid confirmed and on the ground. Second, develop a stronger staffing level in the State Department right now. We have been operating with David Satterfield as an acting Assistant Secretary for the Near East. That's not proper or adequate. We need someone in there on a day-to-day basis. Third, I would urge the President to listen to his advisors, to not think that he is the one who knows more about the Middle East than anyone else, including the ambassadors and generals, and develop a longer-term strategy for dealing with the region and dealing with the problems that the Saudis are facing. They're in desperate need of foreign direct investment, but this Crown Prince, in many ways, is frustrating that. After the Ritz-Carlton affair, foreign direct investment dropped off a cliff, and it's dropped further, I think, as a consequence of the Khashoggi affair. And then I would say, Mr. President, have a heart-to-heart with this Crown Prince and explain to him that American assistance and the American alliance is not unconditional. We may be married in some ways, but there's also the possibility of a rupture in that relationship if the behavior doesn't change. And if it does change, then we will be the first to support the kind of improvements that we would like to think they have in mind for the long term.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Ambassador Jordan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And questions are beginning to flow in here. We should be out by Monday, I guess. Let me start with the order I was given here. Greg Aftandilian, a fellow with the center, says or asks, what are the Saudis' long-term goals in Yemen? Could they live with a Houthi role in a coalition government of some sort, or are they determined to seek a military victory?
This war started in 2015, and each time it has come up, I've asked and many have asked, what are the political objectives that the Saudis have? And every time they've been asked about it, they simply say the unconditional surrender of the Houthis. And that still appears to be their position. There have been peace talks from time to time that have gone nowhere. As the Saudis and Emiratis have shown that they are incapable of winning the war militarily, I think the Houthis have felt emboldened. And by the way, they are not George Washington or Thomas Jefferson themselves. And so they have a lot to answer for in terms of atrocities and in terms of the way they have conducted themselves. But the Saudis appear to have no sense of how it would be resolved. I think the Emiratis have perhaps a clearer vision, which would be a partition of Yemen, which would leave the Houthis in the north to continue to have skirmishes with the Saudis, and the Emiratis would take essentially charge of the southern part of Yemen, where they have already been building port facilities and naval bases.
To what extent has U.S. support for the war effort of the allies Saudi allies in Yemen? To what extent has this been crucial or important, significant?
Well, it's been quite important. We have provided the munitions, the missiles, we provided mid-air refueling, and we have provided intelligence and reconnaissance efforts. We also, as I understand it, have some special forces in Yemen more directed at the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda assets there than the actual war in Yemen. It has been crucial. We have withdrawn now the air refueling, partly because the Saudis have said they can handle that on their own going forward. But we're still providing the munitions, we're still providing the intelligence, and I think the argument is if we didn't provide smart bombs and smart missiles, they would be relegated to using less precise devices and inflicting more civilian casualties. I'm not sure I buy that argument.
Greg Golden from Northrop asks a question regarding kind of the larger region, considering what you just said about the conflicts in the region, whether it's policy vis-a-vis Qatar, Yemen, the Saudi Vision 2030. You mentioned these different aspects of the relationship, but how would this close affiliation or association between Washington and Riyadh, how will that impact our policy in the region, or how the region itself is looking at us?
The other Arab states have viewed the Saudis, I think, for many, many years with some suspicion. The Saudis have been the 800-pound gorilla in the region, and they have not always played nice with their neighbors, even though they have common interests. And so I think the closeness with the Saudi regime, to some degree, is noticed by the other Arab states as perhaps, I wouldn't call it jealousy, but perhaps with a certain amount of skepticism. By the same token, I think the Emiratis and the Saudis have now converged in a much closer relationship than they had had for many years. Mohammed bin Zayed is rumored to be a mentor and advisor to the Saudi Crown Prince. And so we're seeing, I think, a shifting there of some of the attitudes. And so net, my guess is it is not a huge plus or minus that we have this close relationship with Riyadh. I do think there is some trepidation within the Gulf that the Crown Prince is way over his skis and needs to restrain himself. And so the attachment of our administration to the Crown Prince in that sense is viewed as a negative.
Taking that into consideration, Will Embry asks, can anyone control still MBS in the system there? His father, the council, the family?
Yeah. His father has stepped in a couple of ways, and probably in ways that we don't fully know. For example, when the Trump administration announced the relocation of the embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the only states that really reacted with alarm at the moment were Turkey and Iran. And the Saudis and the Gulf states were relatively quiet about it. And then there was talk about the possibility of other moves involving the peace process. And at that point, King Salman came in and essentially contradicted his son by saying, we are going to stand steadfast with the Palestinians no matter what. We are not going to sell them down the river, which I think if we see the Kushner MBS peace plan for the Middle East come out here shortly, there will be, I think, some sacrifices asked of the Palestinians that King Salman perhaps will not support. And so in that sense, he has perhaps played a role behind the scenes. There may also be a role that he has played in the appointment of al-Assaf as the foreign minister. There may be some curtailment of the Crown Prince's powers going forward, but it is very difficult to control this Crown Prince. I think public opinion has the capacity to have an impact on him. I think foreign direct investment has an impact on him. He wants to be the darling of Davos. He wants to have the Davos in the desert next year and have people like Jamie Dimon show up. So I think in some ways the private sector has a role to play here that is underappreciated.
Saeed Arakat, Al-Quds, in light of the Warsaw Conference a few days ago, the whole anti-Iran alliance concept, is it likely from your perspective that there will be some sort of a military confrontation between U.S., Saudi, Israel versus Iran confrontation?
I hope not, and I think it's at least unlikely at this stage, but not impossible. The Saudis have no military capacity on their own to launch an attack against Iran. Iran has a large army and a large population and would make the invasion of Iraq look like child's play. I don't think the American population has an appetite for it. And so I think, particularly with some congressional oversight, we would find it very difficult to engage in that. So my guess is no. Iran has a role to play here, and if they overplay their hand, then you can see a cascade of events where something terrible could happen, perhaps like the beginnings of World War I, the Guns of August, where misunderstandings occurred. A flashpoint hits perhaps in the Gulf of Hormuz or Strait of Hormuz or something like that that could trigger something. But overall, I think it's unlikely you would see a concerted march to war with that intent.
There are several questions that relate to kind of the same topic, which is the future of Mohammed bin Salman. Do you believe all this that we have discussed thus far, and you kind of partially answered that, but is that going to negatively impact his future? And is the world capable or willing to kind of tolerate, if you will, 40 or 50 years should he become king of this type of behavior and maintain a relationship with Saudi Arabia under those terms?
Regretfully, I think the world is willing to tolerate it. I think we have seen the Europeans willing to tolerate it. Certainly the UN has tolerated it. Even though the Germans have now suspended spare part sales and armament sales to the Saudis. The French and the British are quite anxious to sell their Eurofighters and other armaments to the Saudis. We're seeing now the Crown Prince visiting Asia, Pakistan, India, and China. And so what the U.S. won't provide or the West won't provide, he will find perhaps willing partners in Asia as well. They're certainly cooperating with Russia on oil policy right now. So I think we're going to see perhaps a shift where the Saudis are now more reliant on non-Western states and businesses that care much less about human rights and freedoms.
Would you care to comment on this question by Michael Battaglia from Georgetown University? What, in your view, is the outcome of the recent rapprochement between Israel and Gulf states? Is this a long-term premise or a fad?
It's mixed. It is primarily animated, I think, by the convergence of their adversity to Iran, but it's also motivated by the lessening of the Palestinian issue as a top-of-mind element among the Arab world. And it is also animated by increased commercial relations. For example, the Israelis have sold a video surveillance system to Abu Dhabi. The cameras on the street corners are made by the Israelis. And so you've got a lot of business that has been kind of under the radar going on, and a convergence of interests. But I think there will still be a separation from a public posturing standpoint. I think that's going to be a bridge too far for the Arabs right now.
There's an interesting question by Matthew Calardo, BCIU, in terms of your diplomatic experience. When you arrived as ambassador in Riyadh, did you feel you were well briefed, totally ready to go deal with whoever is in charge in there? Did you feel comfortable with the preparation?
Hell no. The Saudis will not give diplomatic credentials to a career Foreign Service officer to be the U.S. ambassador. They want someone who is a friend of the president, who can get the White House on the phone, who can go over the heads of the bureaucrats, and who does not have a career to protect. I see my friend Dr. Janet Smith here, the wife of Jim Smith, my successor as ambassador, and nodding that is exactly what happens. And it is unique then in many parts of our diplomatic corps to have this kind of what I would call a working ambassador, not someone who goes to London or Paris, but a working ambassador with significant policy responsibilities in a hot spot to not be a career Foreign Service officer. I will say that I was blessed to be briefed for quite a period of months from the summer of 2001 until my confirmation in October. I would be here in Washington several days a week. I would meet with think tanks, government officials. I would go down to Tampa to see Central Command. And so I felt that I was as well briefed as I could be. But nothing can really prepare you for all of this. And then, of course, a month before my confirmation hearing, 9/11 occurs, and a lot of the things that I had prepared for certainly took second and third status to dealing with that aftermath.
We've been reading in the news about the transfer of nuclear technology. Some heads of corporations just met with the president and pressured him to allow for transfer of that type of technology to Saudi Arabia. Do you think it's time to do that, and under what circumstances?
Well, if the transfer has already occurred or is being discussed, it's likely in violation of the Atomic Energy Act, Section 123. The Saudis have a legitimate desire for nuclear technology in a peaceful situation. They do not have natural gas, and so to power their desalination plants and their power plants, they're using crude oil that they could otherwise export. That is not sustainable. And so they have been looking at nuclear reactors. They've announced plans for 16 reactors. They have also engaged in other alternative sources like solar. And so I think it's legitimate for them to consider the technology, particularly when crude oil was up in the $80 range. The export value of that was substantial and would justify the cost of a nuclear program. If it were $40, it might be quite different. But the 123 agreement requires that the transferee of the technology acknowledge the limitations on enrichment and on reprocessing of spent fuel. The Emiratis engaged in a 123 agreement, which is what it's called, and made these commitments, and also made the commitment to allow the IAEA to inspect. This is called the gold standard. The Saudis have rejected the gold standard, so we need to be very clear. They are unwilling to adopt the restraints on enrichment and use of spent fuel and inspections that 26 or 7 other countries have agreed to. They have also said that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, they will have one.
Okay, John Anderson, independent analyst, has a question about Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. In light of what you said earlier, they need to realize in Riyadh, in terms of the mutual need, that they need us more than we need them in many respects. To what extent are the investments, Saudi investments in this country, vulnerable to U.S. pressure? And is Saudi Arabia trying to get out of that by, when you look at the trip that MBS is undergoing right now, visiting all these different countries and diversifying his portfolios and throwing numbers all over the place in the hundreds of billions of dollars? Is that an attempt to kind of elude or escape that type of pressure?
I think they're still quite interested in investing in the United States, and in some ways it actually gives them potential power over those institutions. For example, they've invested in Uber, in other Tesla, in other technology companies within the U.S. They are trying to invest in Hollywood through, I think, in Endeavor, which is a talent agency, through partnerships with movie theater chains. So I think in some ways it gives them some clout over the American private sector that we need to pay attention to. And I also think that we're seeing some of those companies now more resistant to Saudi investments or partnerships than they were in the past. And a number of these ventures, I think, for example, Amazon is no longer building a headquarters in Riyadh or Saudi Arabia. So there are some things going on here going both directions. But I think the commercial relationships are important. But I think right now, because of the nature of the regime, a number of American businesses are more hesitant to deal with them.
Again, regarding your diplomatic experience, at what age did you think you were going to become an ambassador or represent this country?
You know, I was just an innocent lawyer in Dallas, Texas when all this came up. But I will tell you this, when I was a kid, I would sit home in the 1950s, I guess, and watch on my black and white TV the proceedings in the United Nations. And I would see Henry Cabot Lodge as our ambassador. I would see Adlai Stevenson as our ambassador during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I really admired these guys. And so a lot of my college work was in diplomatic issues, foreign policy. And then during my time stationed here in Washington in the Navy, I went and got a master's at night in international relations. So it was something that has always animated my curiosity and my enthusiasm. And I'm quite thankful that I had the opportunity to serve. I never really thought that would come up.
Mm-hmm. Albert, who's an undergrad student, would like to know if change of officials or staffing, if you will, does it have really an impact on foreign policy?
Change of staffing?
Yeah.
Yes. For example, my law partner for many years was James Baker, and he tells stories about galvanizing the world after Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. And he had become great personal friends with Edward Shevardnadze. The Russians weren't likely to support a UN resolution condemning the invasion and authorizing the use of force. But because of these personal relationships, he was actually able to get Shevardnadze, which also galvanized the Brits, who were somewhat distrustful of a UN resolution in the first place. His relationship, again, with Margaret Thatcher was important in that regard. And so the figures, the people who are doing the diplomacy, who are exercising the diplomacy, are critically important to the potential success. And if you don't, particularly if you don't even have those people in place, you don't have any staff to interact.
Quite often we see some attempts on the part of either this administration or other administrations talking about or pressuring actually countries like Saudi Arabia with regards to reform.
Yeah.
But mostly it tends to be kind of concentrated in certain areas of life. Will we ever see American pressure for religious reform in Saudi?
There has certainly been pressure. Most of it's behind the scenes. And the notion of naming and shaming has always been very difficult in the Middle East. It's much better in the traditional view to conduct those discussions behind closed doors. So we've certainly had the International Commission for Religious Freedom visit Saudi Arabia usually once a year. During my time, we would always have an annual meeting with great anxiety about whether to designate the Saudis as a so-called country of particular concern, or CPC, with regard to human rights and religious freedom. Finally, in 2004, that was done. And the State Department, I think, resists that sometimes because they want to maintain these relationships. But again, that proves in many ways that you can designate, you can sanction, you can express profound concern and still have a relationship with the country. I think it's going to be very difficult, frankly, in the long run, though, to see much development of religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. You can contrast it with the UAE, by the way, and there are open churches, Protestant Catholic churches in the UAE, freely attended, with no hesitation and no pressure from any source. And so in some ways, the Saudis look to the UAE as a model for the future, and my hope would be they would look to them in this regard as well. But it's going to be a big lift for them, I think.
Okay. Tuna Sanli from the Turkish radio and TV reminds you that what you said earlier about the relationship between Riyadh and Washington seems to be at its lowest point since 9/11.
Yeah.
In light of that, what's your forecast in terms of trajectory? Is that relationship going to stagnate and continue at this level, or do you see it improving, getting out of this rut, if you will?
I think at the executive branch level, They are hoping that the storm blows over, both in Riyadh and in Washington. But I think at the legislative level, the Congress is now going to assert itself in foreign policy more directly than they have in the past, and they're going to try to hold the Saudis more accountable. Where this goes, we don't know, but I think it will continue to be rough sailing between at least our congressional representatives and the Saudis for quite some time. We may well see an effort to push this NOPEC bill, which would make it an antitrust violation to conspire to limit production of oil that has any appreciable impact on American consumers. This is being discussed in Congress right now. We may well see other kinds of sanctions imposed against the Saudis, at least attempted to be imposed by the Congress.
Great. Let me end this conversation on a kind of humorous note. Help me understand your colleague, Jim Baker. During the Middle East peace negotiations, I used to consult with the Palestinian delegation. One day they come out of a meeting at the State Department with Jim, and the head of the delegation tells me, help me understand this term in English. I said, what? He said, the secretary said, you don't want to be caught with the cat dead on your doorstep. What does that mean? I mean, I hate cats. So what does this mean?
I have no idea, but I just...
All right, I was just kidding. Just thought I'll throw that in. He had certain, I mean, the same thing with the Western kind of terminology that he used to use.
Sure.
It's amazing how that stuff kind of shows up in diplomatic exchanges, where you have to corral all the parties and raise the fence so high that none can dare climb the fence. And, you know, you remember that.
He likes analogies quite a bit. His favorite activity was smuggling vodka into Saudi Arabia for President Bush.
All right. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
being with us.
Thank you. Thank you.